Coming up, as the training camp off season looms, less than a week away for the full team, just a day away for those rookies to get back into camp for the New York Football Giants. Still chatter around the league of the QB position. Are the Giants fully locked into Daniel Jones this upcoming season and in the long term, or could Jimmy G-Men be on the rise for Big Blue? We'll break that down and talk the upcoming off season right now. Yes, friends, it is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where, of course, we are your hosts over here. Adam Arbrecht breaking down the Brooklyn Nets on the Locked On Nets podcast with my boy Doug Norrie. And yonder there is Andy Makowitz, seasoned generational ticket holder for the New York Football Giants. And as ever, off a golf weekend, off a Boston trip, healthy, wealthy, and wise. And listen, a little rumor, a little speculation started to circulate here over the last handful of days around Jimmy Garoppolo. Obviously, as we know, it's been anticipated that he was going to be on the move at some point here. It's just a matter of when and where and what the dollar amount's going to look like and what's the compensation as they're ready to turn over a new leaf to their young quarterback. And the Giants got thrown out as one of the possible landing spots. Now, it was mentioned in total speculation randomly. It was also kind of discussed in I think that the Giants would legitimately be in those discussions. They would at least be willing to look at it. I want to philosophically set this up for you because I think this is the only way that it's interesting. We talked about it when we were discussing Baker Mayfield, right? He ultimately goes to the Carolina Panthers. What version would have presented a scenario where you'd say, yeah, maybe the Giants should have been in on that discussion? When it comes to Jimmy G, do you believe that if the Giants think they are ready to compete this year, then Jimmy Garoppolo would be the better option to win now with the team they have in place?
I'm taking a pause for a second because my internet chopped out there for a bit. My internet stinks right now. I'm hoping we could just get through this episode and I can restart it. But yes, I heard you're asking if Jimmy G would be a better option.
Better option for a win now. If you think you can win now this season, would Jimmy G be a better option?
That's a good way to phrase it, Adam, because the issue that we have is that this whole thing seems like it's in fantasy land, and we'll go into that piece of it in a second. But in terms of win now, the answer is still not Jimmy Garoppolo, because Garoppolo can't stay healthy. He cannot stay on the field. So if you trade assets from this team for Jimmy Garoppolo and he gets hurt, you're back at square one again. So for me, I just don't see a world where even bringing Jimmy Garoppolo in helps this in any way. While I'm not saying necessarily that Daniel Jones is better than Jimmy Garoppolo has gone to the Super Bowl before and has won football games, at a 70% clip. I just think that for what Daboll and Kafka want this offense to look like, with creative guys like Wan'Dale Robinson and creating motion, it seems like Daniel Jones at least fits better for what they want to do.
Yeah, you would say, I mean, with, Tyrod Taylor being on the roster, right? It's like he is closer to the mold of what you want, for sure. And I think, again, the only way that you can even frame this is to say the Giants and they, again, Daniel Jones is this holdover piece because they're waiting until they get to the next year when they can go and draft a young rookie quarterback. So if you thought about wanting to make a splash, quote unquote, in your first year at the helm, maybe you go the Jimmy G route for 1 year. And this is where we get into it. And for the most part, again, I don't look at Jimmy G and say, there's the future of the franchise. But you mentioned about the price point is only the last year of his deal. I think that's what matters here as well. And it's why I brought up at the top, talking about Baker Mayfield. Well, at the start of the offseason, it was, look how much money this guy's getting paid. What is it going to cost? Nobody wants to pay that. And then cut to Cleveland needs a bunch of that salary to help get him off the roster. He takes a reduction and sets himself up to have success, hopefully, he thinks, in Carolina. Whereas with Jimmy G making, what is it, $24 million on the books this upcoming season. But again, how much of that are you actually paying, right? The Giants don't have a lot of cap room, so you can't be taking back a full $24 million. How much would you be on the hook for? How much is San Francisco willing to eat? And what type of capital are you really giving back to them, right? Is it going, it's not going to be a first round pick, we don't think. It's not, now, does a team get desperate? If we can talk big picture here, NFL, what team suffers an injury in training camp and all of a sudden veteran Jimmy G is exactly the guy you want to plug in to save a season for a team that knows what their floor is, right? We're a playoff team, and now Kirk Cousins goes down for the Vikings, right? And we think we're ready to compete to be in the playoffs again. Maybe we go get Jimmy G to save a 1-year stopgap for ourselves. Something like that would make sense from like a global NFL standpoint. But how much it costs to get Jimmy G, I think, is relative to this conversation too, no matter who it is, Giants or otherwise, right? If you're in the market for Jimmy G, you're asking the question, how much am I paying for him, knowing that I may only want this guy on a 1-year rental?
Right. Well, and what you notice from the Baker Mayfield deal is he had to actually give up money in order to facilitate the trade to happen. I think he gave up about $4.5 million, but he put himself in a starting position, starting role to be successful. Can I also just make a statement that in March, like on March 5th, Jimmy Garoppolo had surgery on his throwing shoulder and hasn't thrown a football yet.
Well, that's why there's a waiting period too. Yeah.
Right. So like everyone's waiting and seeing what's going to be happening. There's no guarantee that Jimmy Garoppolo is going to look like the Jimmy Garoppolo before. He clearly had injury history before. Like there's no guarantee if you're in win now mode that Jimmy Garoppolo gives you a better chance, not even knowing what he looks like on the field right now. And the question is like, maybe he's still there because his market value is low because he did get the surgery, but there's also whispers that like Trey Lance has been struggling and they have him as an insurance policy for what Trey Lance is doing. So you really don't know why Jimmy G is still there. You just know that they traded 1 million picks to move up to get Trey Lance because they didn't want Jimmy G as their starter anymore.
Yeah, it's the old, trying to prepare for your future and play things smart, but then you spend so much draft capital that people start to ask questions about what your present looks like, and then things start to crumble a little bit. Is there anybody, we'll get out of here, but is there anybody around the league, like a veteran quarterback that you think could end up being available this year? Like I was just scratching my head on, Jimmy G, they have Trey Lance, they have the young quarterback. The Giants don't have someone waiting the wings behind Daniel Jones, nor is Daniel Jones proven to have that talent. You saw Russell Wilson move. Are there any veteran quarterbacks around the league when you look around the league and you say, oh, maybe there's a team that isn't going to be as good as, they hope they will be going into the year, and by weeks 5 or 6, we're talking about some veteran quarterbacks that, maybe it'd be better to see this guy somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, well, think about it. A guy like Marcus Mariota in Atlanta, drafts their quarterback of the future, I believe, Desmond Ridder, right?
My boy.
And all of a sudden, it's like, if Mariota showcases himself relatively well, but we know Atlanta's tanking and they're not going to be in the playoff hunt, and he's actually hurting them from getting a higher draft pick, like, couldn't you see him being moved to a team that has quarterback injury concerns if he performs well? He's one guy that you kind of look at. And then the other one is you kind of look at Ryan Tannehill. Like, depending on where they see him going, he's just another name to look out for, knowing they also drafted a quarterback who Ryan Tannehill said it's not my job to get him prepared for. Like, there's teams that are preparing for the future, like Atlanta and like Tennessee. I think Tennessee's far less likely with Tannehill's contract and their aspirations, but I really do think a guy like Mariota makes a lot of sense there.
Yeah, Mariota is interesting because I think they drafted Ridder. They talk about, hey, this is a guy, give him the year and then he'll be ready to go. But to your point, it's like, yes, but if in a year from now we want to surround him with more talent, why, how high can Mariota take the ceiling there, right? But if you're winning too many games and you prefer to be losing some, that would be the one of them. And then you do mention the Titans. Like, the Titans are such a fascinating team because they were 12-5 last year. Like, they are easily the most disrespected, good team around in the NFL, it feels like, because I rightfully so. You're mentioning Tannehill as being like, if things are starting to go the wrong way, maybe you want to get out ahead of that, steal some value for Tannehill, and then push like a little bit of a preemptive reboot on where you're headed. But it's so fascinating to see how the start of their season.
Well, On that Ryan Tannehill front, Adam, just remember that he is 33 years old. They traded away A.J. Brown. They're going in a different direction. They're focusing on Derrick Henry and running the football. And so, like, is Ryan Tannehill at $30-something million as valuable for Tennessee as he once was? That's a question that I'm not necessarily sure that they believe in. I mean, listen, he threw for 3,700 yards, 21 touchdowns, 14 interceptions, an 89.6 passer rating is just slightly above Baker Mayfield and Daniel Jones. So when we're talking about like where his numbers stack up, Malik Willis certainly has right now a higher ceiling than Ryan Tannehill, in my opinion. It's just how quickly can he get acclimated? Is it going to be at the end of this year that they move on from Ryan Tannehill? Or is it midseason if he's struggling, all of a sudden they make a move? The Giants don't have that luxury in terms of being able to make that move because they don't really have that young quarterback on the roster. Right now, it's either Daniel Jones comes to fruition or Tyrod Taylor becomes a bridge gap quarterback for whomever they draft next NFL draft.
Of course, yeah, and that's all that this is. Listen, we had this happen around the Baker Mayfield discussions. At the end of the day, this is just some fun little conversations before the offseason really gets into the areas that we want to, talking about the young players, seeing where this team can go.
Adam, I'm excited. It feels like we're slowly getting closer to August, which is where the meat and potatoes are. But honestly, for some of the back half of the roster, I'm excited because today is the day where we get to see some of these guys shine that maybe we haven't heard too much about recently. And that's why it's nice that the rookies kind of go in a week before some of the veterans show up at camp.
Yeah, and as we say, while the rookies are getting into camp, so here's the two sides of that coin, right? The one side is, man, I'm excited. Finally, we're getting back into real football conversations and what it can look like and how these players are performing. The other side of that coin, at least for the next week, is, but until we get all of the veterans and the entire complement of the roster into camp, a lot of this is going to feel like the rookie mini camp, rookie OTAs, where you say, yeah, I can speculate on what these guys are capable of, but I won't know until I see the hierarchy of the board build out going into August, right? Where are the reps coming from? Where are guys starting to form on depth charts? Is Brian Daboll giving us any little hints or clues around who's going to be starting? It is exciting, and it's almost like, all the ingredients are there and you're like, God, this is going to be delicious, but no one's made it for you yet. No one's put together the s'more sandwich for you. You can just see the marshmallows and the chocolate and the graham cracker. The fire is crackling in the background. Give me the full dessert.
I love it, Adam. It's so funny. I'm like, the full dessert. And then you got me thinking about dessert. So in the back of my mind, I'm like, what kind of dessert would it be? That would be delightful, actually.
Maybe there's an ice cream sandwich on the way for us here. We'll have to, who knows for certain. But what I will say is, as we talk about this rookie class and undrafted free agents, by the way, as well, one of the things, so we know, right? We've discussed at length the top end of this. We know Kayvon Thibodeau. We know Evan Neal, even Wan'Dale Robinson, right? These guys are getting a lot of coverage from us. So is Dane Belton. They're getting coverage across anyone who's covering the New York Football Giants across the league. But the other rookies then that we're going to start to hear more about now as we hit training camp, we can even go high level. What position group do you think we're going to hear more about from rookies and young players, maybe even before we talk about the specifics of who's going to be coming?
So that's a good one. I think you'll probably hear two specific areas, Adam. One is going to be the tight end position. Obviously, Bellinger's got a lot of shine, but there are multiple tight ends. Austin Allen is another one that comes to mind. The Giants also signed Andre Miller, former wide receiver, moved to tight end. I could see that the tight end position being something we should definitely be looking out for. And the other one is the defensive back position. It seems like cornerback, because the Giants are so thin or there are a lot of question marks at that position, there is an opportunity for one of these undrafted guys or late round guys to be able to rise up and maybe sneak a back end roster spot.
Yeah, I think that's what's fascinating. You mentioned a couple of these groups there. I think Andre Miller, we don't spend a lot of time on him. We weren't as excited as some fans were around him being a wide receiver threat for this team. But now all of a sudden you go, well, put on a little bit of weight, show that some of that carryover athleticism from the wide receiver position can benefit you in the tight end room. And all of a sudden we talk about turning that position over and getting very young very quickly. You didn't mention the linebacking core, I think, is a fascinating one too. Now, listen, have I mentioned Darian Beavers? Of course I have. But, even Mckeithen as well. What we haven't had, though, is the sample size of these guys, right? Hearing their names get mentioned and saying these guys look good, they look strong, things are coming along there. And as we know, we talked about in recent weeks, whether it's Blake Martinez and coming off the injury, we think that won't be a factor necessarily for him going forward. But then you got Tate Crowder, and you just start to look at that group. And I think, the buzz you're going to hear is going to be if these young players look good early, and then maybe you start to hear about, are they looking good enough to be a bigger than just sub package contributor, right? So linebacking core is an area that I certainly look at when we're talking about rookies that we think can have an impact. But we're going to go deeper along this week here because we're going to get sample sizes from a lot of these young players. Hit me with a name, though. You mentioned some of these guys, some of these position groups, but who's a guy that you're excited to watch here and think has a real opportunity to be factor X when we get towards the regular season?
Well, I'll start with one name that's been brought up a couple of times, and that's Jeremiah Hall. He is the fullback, and he comes out of Oklahoma. He was kind of a tight end fullback hybrid. Adam, I think it's interesting because it feels very binary to me whether or not Hall is going to be on the roster. It's like, do the Giants want to have a fullback on their roster? Yes or no? If they do, Hall seems to make it. If they don't, then he's probably going to be a practice squad guy that maybe will get called up if there's an injury to anyone in the room. So, he's an interesting one that I don't know if his skill set is really going to dictate whether he's going to be here. It's going to be more of the circumstance for him. Where I go, very close to that is the running back room and Sean Corbin. Yeah. We mentioned him as one of the preferred undrafted free agent signings. The Giants gave him a little bit of guaranteed money in that guaranteed money pool to be able to go out and get him. Obviously, had some injuries in college. Hamstring basically ripped off the bone. It's just one of those little injuries where the muscle is no longer attached to the bone that it's supposed to be.
My cuticle, and it was not all the way down, but close.
Hangnail.
Yeah, and I had to get the clippers out, and so me and Corbin, I think, are same thing.
What a hero! Yeah, that's why you're both out for a year at the same time. You couldn't type anymore.
Can't do the podcast for a year. It was
exactly. But Sean brings. So there's two reasons why. One is I think he has the ability to make people miss. He has the explosive playability, and that's really where the NFL is going. Is can you make people miss in space, and can you take a 5-yard out route and bring it to the house? I feel like Sean Corbin has the skill set to be able to do that. The second piece of why I like Sean Corbin so much is because I think that there's opportunity within the running back room. We talk about some of these positions, people are buried on the depth chart. I think Corbin has a realistic opportunity to make this roster. You have Saquon Barkley, you have Matt Breida, and you have Antonio Williams as kind of the three that are entrenched as the top three right now. Gary Brightwell a little bit on the special teams. I immediately have Corbin. Adam moved higher up than Gary Brightwell for his upside that he has. But there's a world where, Corbin could end up being the number 2 running back on this roster if he can stay healthy and make an impact early in camp. Some of these preseason times. I mean, do you feel the same way about Corbin?
Yeah, it should be, right? And I think, again, now he's an undrafted free agent, so you don't have to set the expectation bar too high, right? We can't sit here and say he has to be X. But to your point, when you think about Saquon coming off of his injuries, and we know how good he can be, I'm a really big fan of Breida, and I think he has tremendous value for the roster. But Corbin, it's like with a lot of these young players, it's, well, you're something different, though, right? You be something else to add into this mix. And Antonio Williams or Gary Brightwell, I don't even want to knock Gary Brightwell. It just hasn't come to fruition for him to this point. But I think Corbin, if he shows up in camp, and we always talk about, show that you know the playbook. And this is Daboll's words, right? Show it in the film room, show it on the practice field, then you get a chance to show it on game day. And I think from a Corbin standpoint, a guy that's known to be a solid in pass protection as well, that can be a big factor. What if we want to spread things out on a third down play, but maybe we want to have someone in the backfield helping in pass protection alongside Daniel Jones? All of these little things are where I think Corbin makes headway early. And then he can make a big push in terms of just, hey, I can also take the rock, pound it, give you some explosive playmaking as well. So I think if you're an undrafted free agent, you're a young player, check the right boxes first. And that means knowing your role, doing the little details right to begin with, and then you get opportunity.
Yeah, and they talk about Corbin. The last thing I'll say about him, and then I'll turn it over to you, Adam, is one of the strengths that NFL.com kind of talked about, highlighting what he does well. He gets into his cuts with some really good rhythm, is what they say. He fights for additional yardage, and they say he has a background running a variety of routes as a pass catcher. And that to me is the clear indication of he can fill out a place on this roster because the Giants want that versatility. You look at Wan'Dale Robinson, you look at Kadarius Toney, you look at all the players that they want on the field. They want to be able to move these guys around like chess pieces on the chessboard. And if Corbin has the ability to go out into the slot in motion and kind of confuse defenses and all of a sudden him and Wan'Dale Robinson can swap positions on a single play, like that creates havoc for defenses. And like you said, bring something new to the table. I see him as one of those unique components in the running back room that should at least get an opportunity to make an impact in the preseason.
You'd like to think so, right? Some other names that I think jump out. We've talked about Yusuf Corker early on, and I think the secondary as a whole has a lot of intrigue. One of the big things has been who do the Giants? They need to go out and get somebody, right? Talking about old veterans at the cornerback spot. We've discussed around where does Julian Love fall into the landscape, really, of this secondary. But I'll mention a guy in Zion Gilbert out of Florida Atlantic, right? Who undrafted, comes in though, has range, has scored the RAS score we've used to reference sometimes here over the course of the offseason leading up to the draft of an 8.71. I think one of the things that maybe we're overlooking or we've overlooked to this point, and this next week can be a very interesting opportunity is, well, will the Giants go out and make a move in the secondary? They could, but what if we start to see some of these younger players, some of these undrafted players pushing some of the second and third year guys on this roster? Whether or not you say you want to go get a veteran, that's fine. But if Yusuf Corker pushes Julian Love, and I don't even mean that Julian Love has to be gone, but just if Yusuf Corker is pushing for reps, if we think that he's showcasing it over this next week and then into training camp, all of a sudden you're a little bit deeper there than you thought you were, right? If you look at the cornerback room and you say, can Zion Gilbert with some of that range and athleticism come in and push for backup reps early on in camp? Well, all of a sudden, you feel like you have a better baseline of depth there, and maybe it takes away some of this necessity for the Giants to say, well, we need to go get a veteran because the depth is so thin. Even at the very least, if Holmes and Flott and Gilbert and Evans out of LSU as well, right? If all these guys come in and show, hey, we're capable of serving different functions, I think it all feeds back to what we discussed with Wink Martindale. I don't need you to be able to do everything. I just need you to be able to do very specific roles for me early in your career very well, and then we can mix and match as we need to.
Zion Gilbert is an interesting one because you mentioned the size. He's 6'1", but we talk about wingspan. He's got a 6'2" and a half wingspan, so he plays bigger than even his size is. He's got a little bit of a wiry frame, so they talk about how he needs to get a little bit stronger in his tackling. He is an aggressive player. He likes to get into the backfield and make tackles. Some of the pros and cons are like, aggressive in Wink Martindale's system sounds like a really good fit for this, but they're also saying he can be overly aggressive and he may commit to things in man-to-man coverage that he probably shouldn't be doing. So he's an interesting one, but again, this is like an undrafted free agent or a late round guy that you decide to take that obviously has his pros and cons, his strengths and weaknesses. You hope that in the system and scheme that he gets developed in Wink's system, that maybe they can focus those strengths and put them positively towards getting to the quarterback in situational positions.
Yeah, and it really just comes down to, again, we talk about all off season. It's like, what is the expectations or goals for this team this year? This is going to be the factor all off season long going to the regular season. We all want the Giants to be competitive, but is the organization looking at it and saying, yes, we can be competitive, and if Daniel Jones is running right, we can be a team looking for 9+ wins this season, potentially, right? Potentially that can be the goal. Well, then you may want to add veterans in. If we think that, well, yeah, maybe 9 wins is on the table, but our best path to that is having the youth develop, having the youth come on, and maybe seeing ourselves be in games on the back end of the year. That's what should inspire you to go with the young guys, eat some of the lumps early, and give yourself a chance to maybe surprise some teams later on. Can't hear you.
We talked about some of the guys that are at some of the more athletic positions, Adam, like cornerback and running back. And so those are always intriguing. But I know you like to get into the trenches. You like to get down and dirty. You like the defensive line. You like the linebackers. Talk to me a little bit about maybe some players that you think might be on the rise.
Yeah, I mean, listen, DJ Davidson is a guy that I think has really just kind of gone unmentioned here and what his potential is going to be. 325-pounder. We mentioned about what's going to happen across this defensive front. Where is Dexter Lawrence plugging into this scheme here with Leonard Williams, obviously, and now you have these new collection of edge rushers that we want to utilize. But if Dexter Lawrence is going to be getting used across this front, the nose tackle position, the big boys in the middle, you're going to need more than a handful of them in order to be able to sustain yourself on a down to down basis. DJ Davidson has every opportunity. He's a guy we haven't really talked about starting this offseason, but he's ready and available. And listen, he was talked about in the draft saying, wow, the Giants really went and got a guy here. Debatable whether or not they needed to, should have, at that point, but they went and got him. So expectations, at least from an organizational standpoint, seem to be pretty high on a guy like Davidson.
Yeah, well, so listen, Davidson is one of those guys where we forget. I honestly, when we talk about all the drafted Giants, he's the one that you're like, oh, that's right, we drafted him in the 5th round with the 147th pick.
Right.
Like, I forget that he was a drafted guy. I'm talking about Sean Corbin. We're talking about Zion Gilbert. These guys weren't even drafted. Yusuf Corker wasn't drafted. They went up and got Davidson. And I think he fills a good void here. He is not a starter. He is not expected to be a starter. He has challenges in terms of some of his athleticism. It's noteworthy that they talk about him, being a big guy, right? Like he's a very, very big guy. He slides a little bit left to right, but he's not as athletic as other people. But Adam, we don't need him to start day one, and I don't see a path for him to get regular snaps, from the jump. When you look at Leonard Williams, Dexter Lawrence, and guys like Justin Ellis being there, or Jalen Holmes, there's also Jabari Ellis and Chris Hinton that are in this mix as well. There seems like, I will say, because there's only 3 people on the defensive line in a 3-4 situation, there's just not that much room at the end, so to speak, right? Like there's not that many opportunities that he's going to get. Whereas at the linebacker position, you could kind of play inside, you could play outside, you can get on the field a little bit more and contribute.
Yeah, I'll be fascinated to see too about freshness, right? How does Wink want to work in rotations here? So it doesn't even mean, again, Davidson or Ellis, right? These guys may only see 5 or 6 reps a game, but timely reps to just say, hey, go eat an inning here for me so that we can get Leonard Williams, Dexter Lawrence, get a player, a rep off just to get a breather, right? So you're always going to be trying to pick your spots there. Even, and then you mentioned him behind them there. I'll briefly mention, we've mentioned Simone Fox a couple of times because he's a guy that can set the edge. He's only a little over 6'2", 253, but he has a specific role that he can serve. He's going to be fun to watch here just to see if he can carve out a role. And this is all about where the lack of depth. You don't have a ton of not talent, but you don't have a ton of depth or established depth at a lot of these positions. And then into the linebacking core as well, when we talk about Mckeithen and we talk about Darian Beavers. I want to leave a little bit of that for down the road here. I'll throw in one more before we get out the door here. I find it fascinating too, someone like Josh Revis on the offensive line, right? Because we said this before, and you mentioned this a couple episodes ago about wanting to have depth and maybe going out and getting a veteran that could plug into center and then move Feliciano and create some opportunities here for the Giants to be really strong and deep across the offensive line. But a guy like Revis, like right now as it stands, he's just a guy. He's in there for depth purposes, but what happens with Shane Lemieux? We've already talked about Azudu a lot. How does he look over the course of the rookie training camp here and then into the rest of the summer? But Revis all of a sudden can knock off some other names ahead of him on the depth chart, give some versatility. I mean, to say nothing about the fact we know Mckeithen is there as well. Like, I'm just going to lump those young players in as saying, we've had a lot of names around the offensive line. Can these guys just kind of establish themselves even as depth pieces? That's going to be really fun to watch and see how they look and how they develop. Because I think while we know the offensive line is going to be better this year, at least on paper, there are still a lot of questions. We talked about Garcia before. We've talked about Shane Lemieux, right? We talked about Feliciano. Like, there are questions in between your bookends, and I don't think it's a bad thing if we see some rotation and turnover as the summer progresses. But that's fascinating to me, and I think there are open opportunities there from a depth perspective.
Yeah, you mentioned Marcus Mckeithen. He's another guy that got drafted at the back end of the draft, pick 173, that really hasn't gotten that much shine. He's just known as the other guy from North Carolina that,
Right.
that was there with Joshua Zudu, right? But I think what the Giants are thinking, and they kind of stacked us up and said, we just need one of these guys to show up. If one of them ends up being a contributor in this, he may not be a first-round talent, but if you look at Mckeithen, you look at Zudu, you look at Rivas, one of those 3, if you can in a spell this season take snaps at the offensive line position for a drive, a series, a game when someone is injured and show that you're a component of the future, then it's a win for the Giants because you're talking about a late round pick, an undrafted guy, and a mid round pick being involved there.
Yeah, and we'll talk. We'll break down how these players look as we get underway throughout the course of this week. At the end of the day, inside of the offensive line group, remember, I can tell you Nick Gates, Matt Pert, Ben Bredesen, Jamil Douglas, right? Corey Cunningham, Gano. Like, I got 6 names inside of that group that I don't necessarily, they need not be here a year from now, right? So all of these young players just have opportunities to establish that they have value, even in the short term. So it's not about marking guys down for the Pro Bowl, but it's saying a year from now, when half of this depth is gone from the offensive line group, we're okay. We have guys in our system that we've been developing. And as we know, something the New York Football Giants have not necessarily taken the opportunity to do over the last 5 or 6 seasons.
Indeed, Adam, it's all about depth with some of these guys, especially the undrafted free agents. We don't expect them to be starting out on the field week 1, but these are the guys week 4, 6, 5, 6 that you may see rotationally in there, but they're the ones to look out for because they have a week to show it with none of these veterans on the field holding them back.
And don't forget, as depending on how the season starts, trade becomes more possible if you think some of the young talent is developing. So we're going to break this down all week long. You head over to YouTube, you subscribe to the channel, get in on the comments. Who are some players that you're excited to watch over the course of camp, including names that we mentioned without going in depth on, because we're going to break them down all week long. You get the podcast, you get those needs fulfilled. And as always, if you could, if you would, why don't you remember, as Andy Mackwitz wants, needs, and they demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.
I have no real